Welcome to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. I am your host, Molly Southgate, and today I'm interviewing
Justin Rose.
Hey there, how are you doing today?
Doing pretty well. How about yourself?
I'm doing great. As I was saying to you before we got started, I just drove in from Chicago to Minneapolis today, so I'm a little tired, but I'm so excited to be talking with you. We met at C2E2, and I was immediately drawn to your books. They looked so amazing. Can you tell me a little bit about them?
Absolutely. First off, thanks for the compliment on the appearance. I'm really fortunate in the artist I was able to hire, Julian Duvall, who did the artwork on those, and he did just a beautiful, beautiful job. So I write mostly high fantasy, kind of a medieval setting. I have 4 books out so far. 3 of them are a completed series, and then 1 is the beginning of like a related series set in a different time period. So to talk about the first one, basically, it's the story of a character named Rehavan, and he's past his prime, he's aging, but he's lived his life as the captain of guard in this little border city on the outskirts of this human empire of Salinor. And because of the distance between his home and the capital, the affairs of state are very much beyond, unconcerned with anything that goes on in his little corner of the world. And he's grown a bit resentful and a bit like he's lost the sense of duty and care that he had for his empire growing up because he feels abandoned by them. And he's lost any eagerness for violence or any eagerness for valor or glory that he had in his youth because he's been disenchanted and disillusioned. So he's finding a lot more of his joy in his old age in simpler things, in things that are beautiful, things that are innocent, things that are fragile or vulnerable, and particularly in his family. And before I go further with his story, though, I think it's important I kind of discuss one of the background elements at play in the story. There's a nearby city called the Fairy City, and it's, dwelt in by fairies, as you might surmise from the name. And the idea I had for fairies was kind of the very first idea I had for Rehavan. And it comes from a poem by William Butler Yeats called Stolen Child. And this poem is about basically the idea of changelings, but it takes kind of a slightly gentler approach to it. And there's a line in the poem that says, "For the world's more full of weeping than you can understand." And it's all about these fairies bringing this child out of the physical world to the world of the fae, to the world of wonder and enchantment that's gentler and more innocent, is what it sounds like. They're preventing this child from being broken by the world. And I found that a fascinating interpretation. I kind of wanted to work that into my writing. And so I wrote the fairies as this race that the way they replenish their numbers basically is that the queen of the fairies takes children who are extremely vulnerable, extremely innocent, who will be shattered by the world, and takes them to this place of protection and this place of secluded innocence. And so the city is as much symbol and as much emblem as it is a physical place. There's also an underlying current that there's something sinister in this, despite its intended innocence, because you are, in fact, suppressing the natural maturation, the natural progression of life. But to a lot of the characters in the world, it feels like an emblem of innocence. And so that's kind of the role it takes on for Rehavan in particular. So yeah, so there's a bit of layering behind it that's not as apparent in the first book, or at least not till towards the end of the first book. There's this layering of a bit of sinisterness that you don't really see, but the fairy city still serves the role it needs for the themes, and then those themes will kind of become more elaborate as we move forward. There's a character named Rendiriel, who is a fairy who never should have become a fairy, who is not a frail, vulnerable spirit, who is very, very independent and very strong-willed. And so the suppression of her maturation was a bit of a crime. And she's the one exception to the rule where you really see what is wrong with this system, but there's also a balancing effect of seeing the fairy city through the eyes of this father who wants his children to have a place to look to that's innocent. So that's kind of where the themes come from. The basic storyline is that a tribe of goblins in a nearby mountain come down raiding. They attack the fairy city while Rehavan and his family are visiting it. And he's put in a position of having to return to violence to protect innocence. So he's like pulled back into the past he's tried to discard to safeguard the future and the present that's so precious to him. And the question is, what is the role of violence in safeguarding innocence? What is the role of knowledge in protecting ignorance? What is the role of maturity in sheltering and closeting innocence until it itself can grow into maturity? So that's kind of the basic plot and idea.
That is all so incredible. Thank you for sharing all those
Yeah,
themes.
thank you.
So I yeah, I'm just taking all of that in. I'm especially struck by what you're saying about the father and how he's like had that kind of like lost innocence because of these battles that he had to do and like all of like this violence
Yeah.
and how he's looking away from that. And I think in fantasy a lot of the time, and I love fantasy. I love the big epic battles and everything, but it feels like a lot of it is very violent and it is very much
Mhm.
people looking for glory. So that's a really interesting perspective to take.
Yeah.
How did you come up with that?
So there's always been an idea that's been with me that's been very important to me. And it's the idea that the cost of knowledge is innocence. That the way we leave childhood is by, first of all, gaining knowledge of what the real world is. And secondly, by losing the innocence, the naivety that blinds us to it. You know,
I
it's
100%.
not it's not an accident that, like in Genesis, in the creation story of the fall of man, the thing that triggers the fall is the fruit of knowledge. It's like you consume knowledge and are expelled from innocence. And I think everybody has moments in their childhood that they can point at and go, that was when I learned this cold truth, or that was when I learned this hardness, and it was painful and it hurt me, but now I'm something larger, something stronger because of it, or I have a deeper understanding at the least. Like I remember the first time I knew somebody who died. Like I was playing at a friend's house. My mom came to pick me up and she's like, this person died. And I basically pretended I didn't hear her. And it took me several minutes to be willing to listen. And then it took me several hours before I really started to process that this was an actual thing. And, it's those little moments that like click with you that like, so this is part of life. And it's like a little bit of your childish naivety is forever gone, but hopefully you've gained some knowledge in return.
I oh my gosh. I 100% feel that. My mom always tells us this story because I was about 3 years old and I went up to her and I don't remember what triggered this. Probably I went to a lot of funerals as a kid and I
Mm-hmm.
asked her, "Do we all just live to die?" At 3 years old, I was already there. So
It's a tough one for your mom.
yeah, I know. She handled it beautifully and like gave this beautiful explanation about like how living life is important and like don't hold yourself back from opportunities. But I 100% understand what you're saying because a lot of times growing up as a kid, I didn't quite feel like a kid because I was already having those realizations because of
Yeah,
some of these things that I've been exposed to.
yeah,
And like it's a really interesting stance. It's an important thing to talk about for sure.
yeah. Like you talked about the role of violence in fantasy earlier, and all of my books are quite violent. I mean, they're not gruesomely gory, but they're all about war or adventure at the least. There's always an element of violence that's central to the conflict. And what I really try to do, though, is I try to approach violence from a very grave perspective. My characters are oftentimes, some would say too often, defined by guilt. My most noble and most genteel and kindly spirited characters will very often wrestle with the violence that they inflict. And it's a very, very deeply recurring theme because I think it's important. I think it's important to recognize humanity. The one book I write that's really straightforward, a war novel, Hammer of Gath, has a protagonist on either side. Like those are your two main characters. You got one on either side, and there's no good side, no bad side. And everybody's human. Everybody, well, actually, some of them are minotaurs and some of them are elves. They're not all human, but everybody's complete. Everybody's a soul. And I think that's really, really critical too when you approach violence in stories.
Absolutely. That's so interesting. So, what interested you in fantasy as a genre? Is that something you always wanted to write?
Not really, actually. Like I grew up reading mostly classic literature, mostly 18th, 19th century English, French, German, Russian literature. I read some fantasy. I read like basically kind of the ones that are most typical of, I think, children and going up through high school. I read Chronicles of Narnia and Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion. And those were kind of my exposure to fantasy. And it was actually much later, like more towards college, that I actually started reading some more fantasy. At this point, I've read a decent amount. I've read a lot of Sanderson, Robert Jordan, George R. R. Martin. Went back and read Harry Potter, because I skipped that as a little kid. So I came back in my 20s and read it. But, I've read a lot more fantasy now. But what initially drew me to it was it seemed like, it's going to sound like an aspersion on my own work, but it seemed like a shortcut to themes. Because if I can write with multiple races that have predefined attributes, I have a shortcut for introducing conflicts between different types of attributes. Mm-hmm. So my book, again, Hammer of Gath, is a war story between minotaurs and elves. And minotaurs were created by the god Endurance. And they are very loosely based on Greek Stoicism. Like, you're not going to find a 1-to-1 ratio there, but you will see a lot of teachings of the Stoics very much ingrained in them. And it seems natural because they're created by Endurance. The elves were created by the god Philia, that's Greek for like brotherly love, familial love. So they are very much driven by tribal loyalties, by familial ties, by blood. And so those two belief systems and idea systems are naturally going to butt up against each other sometimes, because one is a very individualistic approach, one is a very collectivist approach. And the Minotaurs are democratic because they are all about individual autonomy. Every adult bull is called a ton and votes in the council, kind of like an Athenian system. And the elves are very tribal, and they have a patriarch over their tribe who kind of guides them and is their spiritual leader. And then every elf is bound by duty to protect any other elf, no matter the circumstances, who shares his markings, his tattoos for his tribe. So it was a shortcut, because I didn't have to explain to you that this society has grown up for thousands of years valuing familial loyalty, and that's where they're loyal to family. I could say, well, you have elves that are by their natures inclined to be that way. And it allowed me to play with a lot of themes that I wanted access to quickly.
That is so cool. Yeah. And I think something beautiful, as a lifelong reader of fantasy,
sure,
something that I love about the genre is the fact that it has that shortcut, because it makes authors have to work almost harder to make their theme deeper, to make things more developed. And they can have all of this on the surface, and then there's this extra step that a lot of books take, which I find very intriguing.
Yeah, which is, I think, what the best fantasy does. Like, Tolkien had beautiful, beautiful themes in his writing. If you read the Silmarillion and just look at the scope of events that follow these thousands of years of Elvish history, and all of the different through lines that go from the creation to the end of the Third Age, there's a lot there that would be very difficult to flesh out if you were writing a more traditional narrative in a more traditional setting.
Yeah, absolutely. So, kind of on the same topic, what was your world building process like? Because there's such a dense world here.
Sure. So it's probably a little more informal than it should be, because I started creating the world when I was about 15. I wrote a couple short stories when I was 15, a couple more when I was 16. And I didn't start the first novel until I was 21, so like my last year of college. But the world had been with me for a long time, and it just kind of rattled around in my head and gradually picked up elements here and there.
Oh, that's the best kind of story. I love when that happens.
I'm trying to think of some of the most clear instances of world building. And I think, so I mentioned this poem, The Stolen Child, which is also, there's a musical version of it by a singer called Dorina McKennett that's just gorgeous. And from that song, from that poem, I got my fairies. And that was my initial step into the world of Rehavan. The fairies don't really play a critical role in the overarching stories, but they're a nice introduction because they're very thematically powerful in the story. They're part of a dynamic between brutality and innocence that's very much throughout. I was trying to think of a creation story, and I was reading about some of the ideas of Gnosticism from Greece. And the Gnosticism is a very broad term and encompasses a lot of kind of conflicting ideas. But one of the main ones is the idea that flesh is corrupt and spirit is pure. And so God could not have created people because God is pure and people are corrupt. So God created little gods who created little gods who created little gods, gradually each one becoming more corrupted. And then eventually they were able to create flesh. And I didn't use that specific idea, but it gave me the idea of, okay, a way to get a pantheon would be to have my creator God, who then creates a subset of deities who could play roles in the narrative, but also be set apart from it. And they create the races. So basically I had Phaedra, my primary god, and there's also an element of dualism there where there is a masculine and feminine primary deity. And the masculine is involved in the world of matter and the feminine is involved in the spirit world that comes after. So it's kind of a switching off of roles where in this world, Phaedra rules, in the following world, the feminine deity rules. And as you move from one to the other, you go through that transition. And what I did though is I had Phaedra create a set of gods based on his characteristics: endurance, anger, malice, love, mercy, all these different things, good, bad, the in-between. And they were what created the world. And in response, the feminine deity then created forces. So you have the passions created by the primary masculine god and forces created by the primary feminine god. And those deities are luck, chance, nature, fate, time, these kind of ruling things that administrate and help the world run smoothly. The god of death is one of them, named Ingwe. So basically I got that idea from Gnosticism originally, even though I wound up taking several steps outside it. The Persian civilization and steppe tribes gave me my elves because the Persians had a teaching that all of their children, or all of their male children anyway, would learn to ride the horse, shoot the bow, and tell the truth. That was their three virtues. They had two physical things they learned and one moral thing. And I was like, well, I love the idea of having a kind of tribal steppe feel to my elves. I love the idea of them being all about their relationship to their horses and the bow, which is, fairly typical fantasy. But I wanted to give them one moral aspect also to match with the tell the truth. So I went with loyalty to family, loyalty to blood. And that's why I decided to have Philia, the god of familial ties, create them.
That is such an interesting one because as a writer, there's so many things you can do to that with that, and like seeing how far do they go with the loyalty to family and who do they consider family?
Yes. And so one thing I tried to do was I tried to not make these things absolute. So there's a point in Hammer of Gath where there's this war brewing, where the war is more so caused by the elves betraying their nature and the minotaurs betraying theirs than it is by the two sides necessarily just straight up clashing. And I tried to show that it was the corruption of the internal value systems that really led to bloodshed as much as the disagreement between the value systems. So that was kind of something I really tried to balance.
Really quite fascinating. So when you started writing this, did you know that it was going to become a series and have all of these other elements?
I had some ideas and some I did not. So I wanted to write a number of books. Initially, the idea was there would just be kind of a network of loosely related stories set in different time periods. I didn't have like a progressive storyline mapped out ahead of Ariel's Tear. So actually the order I wrote my books was I wrote my first book, Ariel's Tear, and then I wrote the one that's numbered 4th in a completely different time period. And then only later came back and wrote my direct sequels to Ariel's Tear. So I didn't initially have direct sequels planned, but I did plan it as a world.
Okay. Do you think that this is something that you want to continue writing?
Very much so. Like I have a lot of pokers in the fire at the moment that, different projects I'm trying to juggle all related to the world. And it's something I've very, very much enjoyed. And that only really this last year, like I've been writing these novels for 8 years and I've been writing short stories and stuff for years before that. But only in the last year have I really started branching out and trying to like get exposure, trying to, sell them at cons like where we met, or, advertising them online, things like that. And I want to keep doing more. Like I'm very much in an expansionist mood at the moment.
That's fantastic. Well, these books sound so amazing, and from everything you've told me, they just sound incredible. So I kind of have a question more about when you were younger. What were your reading habits like? Because you're talking about all of this like really fascinating mythology. Is that something you were interested in?
Very much so. Like growing up, reading is pretty much what I did. Like that was it. Like I read, and really honestly, I started writing basically as soon as I could read. So basically, I read and I wrote, and that was my youth. Um, Started off reading. At my earliest memories of books would be like great illustrated classics, where they like drastically abridge a classic book and make like a picture on one page and text on the other. And it's accessible to a child, but a version of a classic story. And that was what made me love classics. And that's why when I started reading, I immediately went to like Alexander Dumas or Dostoevsky or Jules Verne, or all these like typical classical adventure stories was kind of where I really started, and then branched out from there. Kind of developed an interest in mythology through probably Chronicles of Narnia was my first introduction, because it was a fantasy book written by somebody who was deeply invested in mythology, and that kind of bleeds through a fair bit. And so that kind of pointed me back to Greek myths, Norse myths, stuff like that. And then mythology kind of bled over into religions. So I started reading, the Bhagavad Gita, the Tao Te Ching, different philosophies and religions that were related to the mythologies.
So cool. Yeah, I was a Percy Jackson kid, so
I did read
not
some of
quite
those.
into what you're, but still, I loved all of the mythologies. I just wrapped up an oral tradition literature class. Like
Sure.
there's so many rich things there, and as a storyteller, that's so good to immerse yourself in all of these like sort of canonized stories.
Yeah, like A Link to the Past is important to me. Like my favorite book that I wrote was the second one in the series, Ageless Part One. And what I did for that one was I took Joseph Campbell's idea of a hero's journey, where you have 17 steps, call to adventure, refusal of the call, supernatural aid, crossing the first threshold, belly of the whale, road of trials, meeting with the goddess, temptation, atonement, like all these steps leading up to eventually becoming a master of two worlds and having ownership and understanding of the fantastic and the natural world. And I took that story and I said, what if it broke down? And so I had my entire plot mapped out and like outlined based on the hero's journey. And then I said, well, if instead of crossing the return threshold, which is one of the last three steps, instead of doing that and reintegrating, what if the hero accomplished his goal, was successful, but didn't integrate what he learned, failed to grasp that he had made the choices of the sacrifice and didn't own what was important in the story? And that gave me Ageless Part One, which then led into Ageless Part Two, which is basically a breakdown of the hero's journey, a reversal of the hero's journey, where you have this character in decay, and he goes from the antagonist of one, or the protagonist of one book to the antagonist of the next book. And so that link to the past, that mono myth that Joseph Campbell wrote about, I really wanted to have something in my work that was at least a tip of the hat to it.
Oh, so this is an audio podcast, so listeners cannot see my reaction. But as soon as you said that, I just completely lit up. That is
Awesome.
such a fascinating kind of story, and that's such a cool reversal.
Yeah. And I felt almost like I was cheating when I did it, because having a world where all of my gods are named after traits and passions really made it easy to work in a few of those steps, where it's like basically you're meeting with the exact embodiment of that step, because those are already characters in the world.
Hey, that's helpful. I mean, yeah. Is that typical for you to plot out your books beforehand, or kind of look to some of these traditional story structures?
Looking to traditional ideas, yes, not so much story structures. Like that was the one time that I kind of took a pre-packaged idea of a story structure and used it. That was the only time I did that. And that made it a lot easier to outline. That was the only book that I had like a hard and fast outline for. The others, I would have a beginning point, an end point, and like 3 or 4 primary plot points. And then I would have some of the themes and some of the characters. And then I would basically write a couple chapters. And then the developments and the emotions and the experiences of the characters would kind of direct me with what I wanted to say. And I would be able to plot out the next few chapters and then write those and then plot out again and then write a few chapters, plot out again. And basically I always had like a couple pages at the end of my document that were like summary of the next section, but I never had anything plotted out beyond that.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, it's fascinating to hear about everyone's different perspective on it because there's so many different ways that people take, and it
Yeah.
varies book to book sometimes.
Plotting it out makes it so much easier to write, but it's very hard to do in itself. so it's kind of like a catch-22 where like I found the Ageless Part 1 book the easiest to write because I knew every step that I wanted to take. I knew every development I wanted ahead of time. And so I was basically connecting the dots and looking for as beautiful of ways as I could to express each thing, but knowing beforehand what I wanted to express. The other books were more of a adventure of discovery as I went along. And that means a lot more editing to make the narrative really clean afterwards, to really make sure that the parts where I wasn't sure where I was going are no longer present in the final draft. But it also meant that I didn't have to spend a long time not writing, trying to plot every step ahead of time. So
Yeah, I've tried both ways, and I desperately wish that I could outline, but I would not be let into the fairy kingdom. I have too much of a rebellious spirit. So I always end up going, oh no, I'm not going to listen to your rules, even though I was the person who wrote them out.
right, past you got nothing on you now.
I know. What was I thinking back then? So when did you start writing? I know you mentioned already when you started writing in this world, but
Yeah.
just in general.
So before I could read, I drew little pictures in boxes in sequence on pages of like little superheroes fighting each other. And it's just the most horrible child drawings ever seen. But
I love horrible
basically
child
it was
drawings, though. They're
basically
endearing.
narratives. Yeah, it was tiny narratives. And after I started reading and really enjoyed it, as a child, it was meant a lot to me. Then I started writing like little limericks and poems and then short stories. And by the time I was like leaving middle school, entering high school, I had, 6 different thoroughly terrible novel first chapters, like stashed away in little files and folders. Actually, I had a like ancient desktop computer that we got for free from somebody's basement, and it took floppy disks. And so I had all of my writing as a child saved on floppy disks from this ancient computer that would shut off at random times and didn't automatically save progress. So writing on it was like playing Russian roulette with my novels. But that was how I learned as a kid. That's what I did. And then
Have you found a way to get the content from the floppy disks?
yeah, I have a lot of that stuff still.
Oh, good.
When I was in high school, I wrote, or rather, from like age 11 to 15, probably, I was working on a sci-fi trilogy that I had the second 2 kind of roughly plotted, and I had honestly like 200,000 words of the first one written. It was this sprawling book that started when I was 10 and barely had paragraph markers, and then finished when I was 15 and was actually starting to learn a little bit about what it meant to write things. And you could just see my progression all from childhood onward in it. But then I dropped my laptop down the stairs and that one's gone. But
Oh no.
yeah, so I think I finished my first rough novel draft when I was 17. And that was kind of the first thing that I can say I was like, I'm really proud of that one. As a kid at that age, like that was the first time I was like, I'm really proud of this. And then obviously, I said earlier, my first book that I've actually released and shown to the world was started when I was 21, probably released at 22 or 23.
That is awesome. Thank you so much for coming on today. And thank you for
Oh yeah,
sharing your story and your writing journey and everything. This has been awesome.
absolutely. Thank you so much for the invite. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for coming on. I just have one last question, and that is,
Absolutely.
what do you have coming up?
So right now I've got a few different things I'm working on. I have a completed audio drama script that I want to start working on getting produced. It's about 45,000 words, pretty decent sized cast. So actually producing it is going to take me a little while to get all my ducks in a row for. But that's definitely something I'm working on getting started on the production end, and really looking forward to. Aside from that, I also have a sequel to Hammer of Gath that I'm working on. And I'm working on putting together a collection of short stories that I hope to release in the interim to kind of keep up my usual release rate for my books. So
that is all fantastic. The audio drama sounds amazing also. I can't wait to hear that when that gets produced and
yeah, it's a little bit daunting jumping into that end of things without a whole lot of experience in it. But as far as the quality of the writing goes, like I'm really, really hopeful for how it could turn out. Like I care more deeply about that script than probably anything else I've written up to this point, and I'm really hoping to do it justice.
That is so amazing. Everyone, please go buy his books. I implore you. And just keep an eye on this because you have so many incredible ideas.
Thank you so much. That's very, very kind.
Of course. For Read Between the Lines, my name is Molly Southgate.
Justin Rose.
Let's end this the way all great stories end. Happily ever after.
Yeah.
The end.
Thank you for listening to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. You can follow the show on Instagram and Facebook at Read Between the Lines Podcast and on Twitter at RBTL Podcast. Make sure to follow the authors who I've been talking to hear all about their upcoming projects, and also because they're cool people. This show is hosted by me, Molly Southgate, and produced and edited by my dad, Rob Southgate. Read Between the Lines is a Southgate Media Group production, and you can find all the great content put on by the network at southgatemediagroup.com. You can read the story of how I and many other podcasters started in the anthology book Pod Life, which you'll find at the link in the show notes. Also in the show notes are links to buy the books featured on this episode. Using those links supports this show and the incredible authors being interviewed. Have a great week and keep reading.